Welcome back to the Autoblog Podcast. I'm Greg Migliore. Joining me today is Associate Editor Byron Hurd. We got a great show for you today. We're going to talk about the Lexus LX 600. This is the closest thing we get to the Land Cruiser. So there's a lot to peel back on this one. The Land Cruiser and the 4Runner are two of the vehicles that I find to be most compelling. Not the best, but the most compelling historically in Toyota's recent lineup. So I can't wait to hear Byron's take on that. You guys heard me talk about my experience of the Infiniti QX55 crossover coupe that I ended up taking across the state for a long President's Day weekend. I'm going to tell you how that went, and we'll close things out in the review segment on the Rolls-Royce Ghost Black Badge, which was a pretty expensive car. It's podcast number 718, so we've got a little bit of an Easter egg for you on that one. Close things out with Byron's take. Used car spotlight on the Viper, another one of my favorite cars that I've been privileged isn't the word, scared, enjoyed, I don't know, to drive over my career. So Byron, bring you in. What's up, man?
Hey, I'm with you there on the Viper. It's one of those cars that I've lusted after since I was old enough to understand what a car was, pretty much. And you know, I've been able to drive a few of them over the years, but not all of them, which is the goal. I mean, I would like to own all of them ideally, but driving them will be a start. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about that too.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So let's kick things off with the Lexus. I almost call it the Lexus Land Cruiser. That's not quite what it is, but you drove it recently. You drove it in Metro Detroit, actually. Got to kind of conquer the bumpy, broken roads. But this is actually a big play for Lexus. It really gives them a spotlight, almost Halo type SUV flagship right now. All I can say is I think it looks pretty good. It fits in with their design language with still a bit of a kind of a brutish kind of vibe, but that's not really the story here. The story here is how it drives. But what were your initial impressions of this?
Well, honestly, I went into it kind of with an open mind, just thinking like, okay, the original plan was that I was going to drive this on the launch event that was going to take us on this like off-road trails and stuff like that. But then there were some, various personal reasons why I wasn't able to attend that. And so, yeah, I ended up driving it here around Detroit. And so they gave us an F Sport model, which is, supposed to be the handling version of it. And that's, fine for, driving around on nice smooth roads. But this time of year, and especially with the weather we've had recently, that was not really the environment that we had for the vehicle. So, I mean, I was really impressed by that engine. That new twin turbo 6-cylinder is excellent. It's very punchy. The response is immediate. It's not, it doesn't feel anything at all. Like even like the snappier V8s are, especially these days, they're very responsive. This is just on a whole different level. It's an amazing powertrain. I was really happy with it. The thing about driving that I didn't really enjoy was the F Sport angle, because this time of year it was that, the sensation of driving a big, very luxurious SUV that was just being so constantly punctuated by potholes and stones. You could feel everything through those big, they're 22-inch wheels with relatively thin tires. That's just a lot to deal with when you've got broken roads. So, as a luxury truck, it didn't really excel given the circumstances. And then as kind of a more rugged off-road truck, it didn't excel given the circumstances because of the kind of conflicting mission with F Sport. But, if you live someplace where the roads are good year round, ideally, or at least for most of the time, where you actually can enjoy a nice smooth surface for a few miles at a time without having any kind of problem, then yeah, the F Sport would be an amazing machine. But for living around here, for living anywhere where you experience seasons, where you have roads that go through frost heave or get badly potholed or rutted, you really don't want the F Sport. You want to go for maybe one of the luxury options or something like that. Something with maybe a little less wheel and a little more tire, and just less of a focus on the performance. Which honestly, like in the few sections where it was really smooth, it felt pretty good, but it just still feels so big. It honestly. It was kind of weird looking at the spec sheet with this car, because it's a little bit smaller than some of the other like big luxury players you can get in the SUV space. It's closer in size to the Europeans, smaller than the Americans. So your Lincolns and your Cadillacs are bigger, more comfortable, I'd argue, more spacious, especially in the rear. The third row in the LX might as well. I mean, it's useful in short doses, but it's not meant to be a full-time space. And you really notice like when you actually start fiddling around with the cargo space, but it's got kind of the feel of a smaller SUV until you have to turn a corner. And then it goes from feeling like the European SUVs that it's about the same size as to feeling more like a big American luxury SUV. And for me personally, that's not really the combination I want. I would rather it feel more nimble when the road turns and perhaps just be a little less stately as a highway vehicle. You know, like I would rather have kind of that more buttoned down, perhaps a little, you know, edgier, perhaps maybe too harsh for some luxury customers feel to it. But the thing is with this, like, you can't really get one or the other. You're getting a compromise of both. And so in my mind, it really takes a customer who lives someplace where they have a very specific and well-known pattern that they can rely on in terms of the weather and just their daily routine for where this truck actually makes a lot of sense.
You called the interior a little more coherent than some of the other parts of the vehicle. I think that's an interesting take because Lexus interiors to me have been they're very hit or miss. I think depending on the product, I either really love it or hate it. And sometimes it depends on if it has like the F Sport trim or it's just more of a base model. So, I mean, and that's really the mission of this SUV is it's going to play the luxury space. So, I mean, what do you think of the interior?
I thought it was actually fantastic. I don't know that I would necessarily pick the F Sport interior specifically, at least that F Sport. Mine had the red interior upholstery, which is, that's fine. I like that in some cars. This just isn't one of them. But I actually thought the interior was very nice. The only real complaint I had was that cramped third row, which, I mean, you know, when it's deployed, it takes up all of your cargo space basically. And when it's not, it's, you know, big enough to kind of, you know, be in the way a little bit. So it's kind of hit or miss there, but like the front two rows, especially up front in the cabin, it's fantastic. The new infotainment system in the LX is better than it has been in really any Lexus product I've driven in the last 10 years. And of course, this now has the new touchscreen infotainment system that replaces the old remote touch trackpad thing that was kind of a mess. And the nice thing about the LX is you actually get a large enough screen space to take advantage of all the tech that system actually has to offer. The only real downsides to it are that, sure, you have this big screen, but there's no like split screen functionality. There's no way to get it to show you more than one app at a time, or like, you know, have like maybe a small nav map in the corner and then a larger space dedicated to something else. Whatever you're looking at, that's where you are. There's no home screen. There's no nothing like that. There's no kind of default place to go back to. The only display you get is whichever app you're using, whether it's nav or the radio or some vehicle information display. The nice thing about the LX, because that's true of all of Lexus's infotainment at this point, like all their new models are being done that way. The nice thing about LX specifically is it actually has a separate little driver information screen below the main infotainment screen, where you can see some additional information, but it's very limited. It's usually in the LX, for example, I think it was like the 4x4 display. So you can see like the vehicle yaw or pitch or stuff like that, like things that you don't actually have to look at. And you probably only would maybe once or twice. And some of the climate control display is down there too, which is nice because you don't have to go hunting for it in the main screen. So while it's still imperfect, it's probably the best execution of the new Lexus infotainment of anything we've seen so far. So I was pretty impressed.
It's a very competitive segment too. You know, there's everything from the X7 to the Grand Wagoneer, the Escalade, the Navigator, the Mercedes GLS. All of those are excellent vehicles in their own right. Some of them have some issues, like the Grand Wagoneer's fuel economy is not so great. You know, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses. Where do you think this fits in what is a very crowded segment?
Honestly, I think this is the kind of vehicle that's really just going to kind of carry on with its existing buyer base. Like these are people who, you know, they were buying these before, they're going to buy them again. You know, it's a very loyal brand. I think Lexus customer retention is still probably among the best in the business. And there's a reason, you know, like, and the Land Cruiser underpinnings are nice, especially since now there's no Land Cruiser alternative, right? So if you want this formula, this is the truck you buy. There's really no alternative. So I would see it as the, you know, the customer who still wants an alternative to bigger American luxury SUVs, but for whatever reason doesn't trust the Europeans to be reliable or to be affordable or available, which right now is a whole weird thing. I would actually be more concerned about the Lexus than anything else right now. But you mentioned the Wagoneer, and that's one I actually haven't had a chance to drive yet, and I'm really looking forward to. But it's an interesting counterpoint because, especially if you look at a Grand Wagoneer, you're getting more space than you're getting in the LX. You're getting a far better infotainment system and other general stuff, all the stuff you get, you connect, all the additional like entertainment stuff that's available with it. You get a lot there, and you're still getting the size. So that might be kind of best of both worlds. The downside is, as you mentioned, fuel economy, where this new turbocharged 6, the smaller form factor of the LX itself, it's going to be a little more frugal. It's not going to get great gas mileage. It's just not going to get as bad gas mileage as it used to. I think by the time I was done with my loop, I was looking at about 16 on the display MPG, which my drive is probably about 30% highway and about 70% surface streets. So that's about right. I think the EPA said that was about where it should be in mixed driving. I'd have to double check. It might be 18 or 19, but it was, on par. And I wouldn't be surprised if I did that same loop in a Wagoneer and got 12.
I think one of the, not to over-index on fuel economy, but these are also very expensive vehicles. So it gets to the point where if you are sort of, willing to pay this much, and this is the experience you want, this is the type of attitude you want your large SUV to have, a couple of miles per gallon maybe doesn't make as much of a difference, depending on what you use it for. If you are rolling up the miles, then it will hurt your pocketbook regardless. But, sometimes different considerations don't carry the same weight in different segments. I'm very excited to drive it. Everything in this segment, I think, is the right SUV for the right customer. Now, let me unpack that because it's a bit of a cliche. The Grand Wagoneer is the right customer if you love Jeeps and like the interior is the most important thing to you. And frankly, the infotainment, I think, is probably the best among the vehicles that we're talking about here, just because Stellantis's system is so good. The Mercedes GLS, that's a good one. Obviously, the X7 to me has an attitude. I think it's got some design. I don't know. There's a flashy design there, depending on how you feel about the grille. Then you get into the Escalade and the Escalade and the Navigator, which, if you want brash American luxury, those are your cars. Lincoln has that mid-century modern kind of vibe. Cadillac is kind of going with like a tech sort of feel. So it's a very competitive segment. And I think we're at a point where, depending on what flavor of decadent SUV you like, it's there for you.
Yeah. I mean, if you're prepared to spend around $100,000 on a luxury SUV, you really do have some great options right now. And honestly, I think the thing that's really going to push this over the top for some people is the fact that a hybrid's coming. I know we just said that, with a vehicle like this at the price point we're talking about, fuel economy is probably lower on the list of considerations for a lot of customers. But looking at 4xe coming for Wagoneer and looking at the eventual hybrid model of this, I mean, I don't even think Lexus has outright confirmed it, but I mean, it's happening. The Toyota Sequoia has the hybrid version of this powertrain. The Tundra is getting the hybrid version of this powertrain. It seems highly unlikely that the most profitable version of this chassis that they're going to sell in the US isn't going to get the most profitable version of that powertrain. So, it's an inevitability, really. And I think it'll help a little bit differentiation wise once that actually does show up. It'll be kind of interesting to see whether people respond better to the plug-in in the Wagoneer or this, what we expect to be a standard hybrid in the LX.
To bring this all together, to go back to the original question about the Land Cruiser, you can still get somewhat easily like a 2020 or 21, whatever that last model year was, of the old Land Cruiser. That's got the older engine in it, which is like ancient at this point. Fuel economy is, not great. Really old school infotainment. But for some people, that is the aesthetic. That's the experience they want. Nothing else will do. I've always argued that the Land Cruiser is more prestigious, even with the Toyota badge, than really the high-end Lexus ones, because if you know what you're talking about and you see the Land Cruiser, you're like, oh yeah, that's kind of what I want, as opposed to, whatever the LX something happened to be at that moment in time. So it's your money. What do you do? Do you go with like the most recent Land Cruiser, or do you upgrade given all of the metric improvements? I mean, under the hood, inside, I mean, this new thing is going to be better. So, I mean, where do you land in that kind of argument?
Yeah, that's a good question, honestly. I think given how weird the market is, if I have to go out and do it right now, that's really tough. Because my instincts tell me to go with an older Land Cruiser, because that's just, proven, available, less expensive. All of those are good things. The only downside is right now that less expensive and available are kind of relative terms, because you're definitely going to be paying more than you would have 2 years ago for this kind of car. And the fact that it's been discontinued and that it's so coveted by enthusiasts is going to make it even more in demand. So yeah, it's kind of interesting too, like that Toyota didn't provide us with another alternative. Like, it seems still sort of strange that Land Cruiser just kind of up and vanished from the U.S. lineup without a replacement. And when they teased the new upcoming electric Toyota vehicles, there was that little kind of FJ Cruiser looking thing that was in there that kind of makes me think, okay, so that void's probably not going to remain a void for long. There's probably going to be something that ends up filling that. Maybe it won't be a traditional Land Cruiser based thing. Maybe it'll end up being electric. Maybe it'll end up being, who knows? It could be something we haven't even anticipated. But it does seem like a very kind of unusual place to just kind of leave something on the table, especially in a market that just doesn't seem to be able to get enough of SUVs.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It kind of makes me really think back to the history of the Land Cruiser. This, like the most recent one, really evolved basically to fill a gap in the Toyota SUV lineup, as opposed to like some of those FJs and just earlier iterations of it. So it really became something that perhaps it wasn't. It's almost, and this might be an extreme comparison, but it's almost like if the Wrangler had become the Grand Wagoneer or something over time, which it didn't. I think Jeep played their cards a little bit better and tried to use the Wrangler as a halo, and then they built other things. I'm intrigued. If they did build that sort of, FJ type thing, that might slide in better for Toyota. Then you have the large luxury thing over here, which is the LX 600. I mean, just from like a very like unemotional perspective, this is like better than any Land Cruiser has been in recent years, from powertrain to it sounds like from a driving dynamics to just all of the other things stem to stern, including the infotainment. Like, it also seems counterproductive to say, okay, we do need to bring back the Land Cruiser. Let's slap the Land Cruiser badge on this thing. And then you've got two vehicles basically competing with each other for a pretty similar audience, given just what people actually use the Land Cruiser for. Like, I would buy the Land Cruiser, but like, another dude's going to say, well, no, I want the Lexus. I want the Lexus badge. I heard of the Land Cruiser. Grandpa had one. That's not going to be what I want. So to me, it makes a little more sense to drop in that type of FJ model, use that as your SUV halo, and go from there. Although then there's a part of me that just wants everything that I want, and I want an updated version of the last Land Cruiser. So,
yeah, that's valid.
It's not my money. It's not my problem. But I'm just saying that's, it's also kind of a good problem to have, because Toyota's had a pretty good, they've had a good, strong lineup of SUVs that can do a lot of different things while being very true to the Toyota and Lexus sort of, sensible, still premium ideas for the lineups, for the SUV lineups. But also there's been a good deal of emotion in there. I mean, BMW doesn't have like some off-road thing like the Land Cruiser that Toyota did for how many decades. So that's, to me, that's to their credit.
Yeah.
So, I think we've hit this pretty hard. Any final thoughts?
No, I was actually, you brought up the point of being able to do a lot of things with an SUV, and I was just watching the video you did of packing up the QX55 for your road trip. So I feel like I should just hand it right back to you and let you talk about that.
Sounds good. So I teased it out a little bit last week on the podcast. I had some initial impressions. All I really did with the QX55 is, take my kid to school and back, that sort of thing, got some groceries. we did a weekend on the west side of the state, kind of like a winter getaway, did a nice Airbnb, walked along the frozen Great Lakes, specifically Lake Michigan. Really beautiful place, just kind of get away from everything. And candidly, I was supposed to have a Cadillac Escalade. Speaking of large SUVs, that fell through at the last minute. QX55 fell into my lap, and I was like, well, no, we could still take this. We talked about it because we were going to bring a sled and some other things. We're like, is that going to really fit in this thing? I've been very aware of the crossover coupe or coupe crossover, if you will, sort of styling. And, you kind of wonder, is this really going to work? Are you going to get everything in here? The hatch comes down at this pretty severe angle, but it worked. I'll say this, there were 3 humans and 160 conservatively, estimated pound golden retriever. She is a large dog. And so all 4 of us fit in there pretty well. Car seat. Cabin was very nice. It was funny because we were talking about taking just like the family 3-row Acadia. And we're like, that's big. We could get stuff in there. But then I'm kind of like, well, I mean, hello, I'm an automotive journalist. I should take this press car. It's a very nice interior. It has all the electronic gizmos. So we landed on that, and it's doable. This started out as a YouTube caption. It morphed into just a quick shortcut video that you were just watching there, Byron. So thank you for that video view and all the associated ad revenue that goes along with it to keep Autoblog solvent. And now I'm at like 600 words. I think this is going to be a road test. If I could just basically pull out the Monroney, dump some specs in there, and it's interesting how you could build a story around an idea, which is how it's supposed to work, right? So, it's doable. And to me, this kind of disproved a theory that I've held for some time. I basically thought X4, GLC coupe, don't waste your money. Just get the actual compact crossover. Don't get the coupe one that cuts down your practicality even more. Just do that. But you don't lose that much space in a practical sense. We were able to get, 2 pretty large suitcases in there. One was a duffel bag, the dirty laundry bag, the sled, the dog stuff, a box of food. We came home with more stuff because we hit a couple of breweries. So, when you're trying out some of those, good Michigan brews, you always have to take some to go with the takeout and stuff. So we wedged a lot of stuff in there, and it worked out pretty well, surprisingly well, I would say. And I think it's a little bit, I want to be a little self-aware here. Again, as an auto journalist, we put these things in rigid boxes, and it's no, you don't get the crossover coupe crossover, whatever these things are for this. You get the larger SUV, or you get the minivan, and it's there's these things, and we're very defined by these criteria because frankly, that defines our jobs and the comparisons we do. But that's not how most consumers work. Consumers would say, hey, that thing looks good, I'll get it. Oh yeah, no, it's still a pretty big trunk. Yeah, no, I want that one versus this one. And then as I was kind of writing this out, it's well, yeah, the powertrain's identical. The cabin, except for the hatch, is otherwise identical. Aside from a slight variation in shape, it's the same car, So it was, pretty good. All-wheel drive, VC turbo, 268 horsepower, 280 pound-feet of torque, if I'm remembering that right. The Infiniti sort of electronics still kind of bug me. It's hard to turn off that sort of lane departure thing that gives you almost that very aggravating get back in your lane kind of vibration and sound. But, it worked. You can do it. I would say if there had been one more human being, it wouldn't have worked, obviously. Yeah. Even if one more human being instead of the dog, because the dog travels light. A human would have needed another suitcase, which would have probably put us over the top. But it worked. It was fine. It's a stylish car. And that's kind of why you buy this thing too. Whether you want the 50 or the 55, it's that's why you get this, is how they look. And I think that's been Infiniti's calling card for, 10, 15 years now. Their cars have been really attractively styled. They've been different than other things you can get. So yeah, it's like, that's literally like one of the final lines of my story is like, it's doable. You can make this work if you like how it looks, and maybe you're using it, like you're not hauling stuff. Like, I don't know what people, who would buy a compact crossover and then use it to routinely haul stuff, but if this is your weekend warrior, it's doable and it's fine.
Well, I think at this point, you've now spent more time behind the wheel of a QX55 than really anybody else on staff, just by virtue of having done that road trip. So
yeah,
I don't think any of us have been particularly blown away by it. I think the general consensus is that it's, it's good, it's competent, but it may not be our first choice. Has this pushed it up any in the standings in your mind?
No, that's a great question. I still think, like, when you look at the field, like the Germans for sure offer you something that's a little bit just better in some way. I think it's competitive. There's no reason not to buy it. Let me put it that way. The thing that if you're like an enthusiast and you're hoping to have something that's a little more fun to drive, you got to look at like the Audi or probably the BMW too. You buy this car because you like how it looks. You buy this crossover because you like how it looks. Otherwise, I tend to like the Audi and the Mercedes and the BMW a little bit more. And even the BMW X4 styling, I think, is a little bit more, I just kind of like that look too. So, I mean, to me, you start to cancel some things out if like styling isn't your number one criteria. Like if you own a 3 Series, this isn't your compact crossover. You're going to stay with BMW or maybe look at Mercedes. If you're looking to upgrade from, say, like your CRV or your Equinox or something, you're probably not going down this road either. But it's very credible. It's a decent deal too. Like the base MSRP, gets you in there in the 40s, whereas the Germans tend to get up into the 50s pretty quick. I think it's like one of those things which we go back to the cliche, all cars are good or most cars are good. This really like sort of proves that cliche. It fits right in that thing where like, would I rank this dead last in the segment? Of course not. It's very, very good. Would I say it's like number 1 or 2? Well, no. There's a couple other things I would immediately put in ahead of it. So it's just like right in there in that middle part of the pack where it's like, if you're shopping the segment, you like how it looks, there's no reason not to get it. It's definitely should be part of your purchase consideration. So probably rolled up about over 400 miles in this thing. So honestly, that's more time than I think I've spent in almost any car recently, to be honest, not just the QX55. So yeah, I'll get that up probably in the next week or two. Look for it. The site, that's autoblog.com, obviously. And check out the video in the meantime. You went a little more upscale though. Rolls-Royce Ghost Black Badge. Tell us about that.
I always struggle with cars like this. When I say cars like this, I really mean anything that costs more than, say, arbitrarily like $150,000, because I don't even know what to say about most of these things half the time. It's like, what can I say to somebody who actually wants to buy a Rolls-Royce that is in any way going to inform their decision from my perspective? Like this car costs more than the house I just bought. Like there's no, for me, and you might get more room in the Rolls-Royce too, now that I think about it. But yeah, I mean, this one checked in $484,950. And I mean, the Black Badge package alone really kind of, it's puzzling to me. It's $43,850. And from what I can tell, it's mostly just a popular equipment package. So like this would be, a Nissan Midnight Edition, essentially. Just, ratchet it up. It costs more than an entire Nissan, essentially. So, but yeah, we had a great time with it, I have to be honest. My girlfriend and I took this out to a family lake house up near Pontiac. And it was after we got that snowstorm last week. So we probably had a good ½ inch of ice plus about 7 or 8 inches of snow on top of it. It was pretty healthy snowfall we got. And of course, this thing came with winter tires and has all-wheel drive. So I was thinking, okay, this is either going to go really, really well or really, really horribly. And fortunately, it ended up going really, really well. That thing was beautiful on the highway. It was beautiful even on literally unplowed dirt country 2 lanes that had just been dumped on and never touched. There were pickup trucks, slowly picking their way along, and SUVs slowly picking their way along. But this thing was just completely unstoppable. And that suspension is just magic. You really can't throw anything at it that it can't handle. And with just the transitions in between dirt and paved roads, you couldn't even tell where they were half the time. You just continued to glide on through, but with none of that floatiness that you get that makes you feel like you're way too isolated from what's going on around you. So, the cliche is that you drive a Bentley, but you're driven in a Rolls-Royce, right? So the way a Rolls-Royce drives actually shouldn't even technically matter that much, but the fact that they put so much effort into making it good is part of why it is what it is. And I mean, yeah, for a $500,000 rolling mansion, it was an incredibly impressive piece of kit. And I have to admit, maybe the most fun I had with it, I mean, we're talking about a 6.75 liter, because of course we can't just round, 12-cylinder engine that makes 591 horsepower, 663 pound-feet of torque. It is basically a freight train without cars behind it. So of course it's quick, and of course it feels effortless, but the back seat is really the most interesting part of that car. And, just lounged out at the lake house with the back seat in full recline, looking up at the ceiling with the Starfield LEDs going in the headliner. They're literally like shooting stars going across the headliner while you're just sitting there relaxing. And of course, the battery in the thing is enormous. So you can sit in the back of that car with all the gizmos going and the little fold-out tables and the display screens with the entertainment functions in them. You can have all that going for quite some time without the car running. So I just sat out there until it finally started to dim the lights and say, get out. And it was just one of the most pleasant and serene experiences I've ever had in my life. And it was sitting in the backseat of a car in a driveway. And it's, again, to invoke the whole automotive journalist thing, that's not something I would ever have expected myself to say. Like, give me a 911 GT3 RS and Road America. That's my heaven. But I've never felt more relaxed. It was as mind-blowing an experience as you would expect from a car that costs $500,000. We'll put it that way.
What do you think about Rolls-Royce just as they head into just this new world, of where they stand? I came across an old Rolls-Royce clock. It's funny. It was like one of those like sort of dresser model type things. It's probably like 50 or 60 years old. It's like super old. And it's like, I think it's an alarm clock. I don't quite get how this all works, but it looks like essentially a very nice model Rolls-Royce Ghost.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's the model is of a car from the 20s. I think the model is from like the 70s. But it just kind of reminded me of like just the aura, the mystique of Rolls-Royce. But I don't know. I mean, how do you think that translates going forward? I mean, there's always going to be somebody with money who wants something because it's expensive, but it also has to be really interesting and compelling, So, I mean, does this start to, is there a reason to buy this thing beyond the badge? I mean, do you think Rolls-Royce's buyers are going to still be with us, in 20, 30 years?
I think so. And to your point, I think back, one of my favorite lines ever in a movie is that scene in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade where there's the little, some sort of local governor who sees the Germans coming in and offers them all sorts of supplies for their little expedition in exchange for the bad guy's Rolls-Royce Phantom. And so it's that moment where he's just like, Rolls-Royce Phantom 2. He goes through his little spiel. He's like, and I even like the color. The guy says keys are in the ignition. Rolls-Royce just has that presence. You said it. And honestly, it's their game to lose. Like, they would have to go out of their way to fail, I think. And you look at these cars, they're not meant for normal people. They're not meant to be purchased by people who need to rely on them. They're not meant to work every day. I mean, that sounds silly. Of course they are, because, you spend $500,000 on a car, you're going to expect it to work. But it's not your livelihood that's at stake. It's the 4 people who work for you and maintain your car and, maintain your relationship with Rolls-Royce, right? So Rolls-Royce can afford to make what might be an objectively bad car and still succeed, because Well, if your one electric Rolls-Royce that weighs 14,000 pounds needs to be charged, you just go around the back and get your other Rolls-Royce that doesn't need to be charged. Like it's one of those cars that exists so far outside the context of what we think of for personal transportation that I just don't see a way for Rolls-Royce to screw it up unless they are so dialed in on the traditionalist aspect of the powertrain that they just refuse to change and kind of doom themselves. And even that may not doom them ultimately. I mean, you figure like even if car ownership goes the way of horse ownership, and in 25 years, there are just those of us who are enthusiasts. We have our little equivalent of an equestrian farm that's like a little private racetrack with our fancy old gasoline burning cars, and everybody else is flying around in little electric VTOL drones and stuff like that. Rolls-Royce will still have a place in that world because there'll still be somebody who's willing to spend the money to ride from one end of their estate to the other end of their estate in $1 million car just because they can. So honestly, like it's so much more a symbol of opulence and success than it is a car that I just don't think the normal rules apply.
It's interesting. I think the Rolls-Royce customer base has not changed all that much since like the days of Downton Abbey, when like the Rolls-Royce it was maintained by somebody and then you were driven in it, or you maybe drove it for recreational purposes. And I mean, it still maintains a lot of that, just like, truly authentic, truly decadent. And, it does maintain the mystique a little bit. So I'm going to have to go for this podcast. Maybe when we tweet it out, I'm going to have to find that model Rolls-Royce Ghost. I think it's a 1914, and maybe tweet that picture of that out. And if you're listening, hey, that might be something you might be as interested in as anything I have to say. So,
yeah, that would be really cool. Actually, I'll try to remind you just in case. That'll be a good little interesting bit to put into the piece. But yeah, it's one of those cars where I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I felt like it, to a very small degree, I could almost catch a bit of what it's like to have a car like that, where that even when it's not the right tool for the job, it'll still get it done. A rutted 2-lane country road covered in snow and ice. I mean, a lot of people who would actually spend $500,000 on a car probably wouldn't want to subject it to something like that unless they can afford to buy 20 of them. So like, it was a little outside the norm, but at the same time, for brief moments, I could picture myself as that landowner in England, just trundling down his back lane, trying to get to his hunting cottage before the blizzard hits. There was that little bit of like, old school country wealth feel to it that I was able to kind of vicariously enjoy in those moments where I wasn't trying to dodge a Grand Cherokee that was going sideways around the corner or something. So.
Did you have your barber jacket on? And I guess I had the retriever with me. You needed like the hunting dog or something. And
yeah, I in an old 10 gauge or something like that. Yeah, it would have fit perfectly, but. No, I settled for a nice case of local beer and just a quiet evening out at the lake. So nice. Sounds good. Well, this is episode 718. So Porsche, I think we should probably reference something to that. We've probably missed a few opportunities, like episode 707. We could have had a whole series on the different Hellcat ratings, probably. True. 718. I mean, that is, definitely an iconic figure for Porsche. And we've both spent a lot of, probably interesting drives in Boxsters and Caymans over the years. But why don't you tell me one of yours? Well, my most memorable one, going from one weather extreme to another, 2010 or 11 Porsche Cayman R. That was actually the first Porsche I was ever loaned in this business. And it was a black model that was very much set up for the track. It had the really aggressive bucket seats. I mean, you fell into those seats. They were barely adjustable, and they were built to basically like set up for a harness. Like they're fantastic. And it had no air conditioning. And I got it delivered in August in the DC area during the middle of a heat wave. And so during the day, it was probably about 105. And it felt like 120% humidity. It was probably only about 90. And it was just a sweat box. I mean, black car, no AC, fixed roof. There just wasn't a whole lot of relief from the discomfort. But of course, I had never gotten a Porsche press car, so I was out driving it every chance I got. But one of my favorite moments with it was, I think maybe a Friday night going into a long weekend. They actually extended the loan because the company that was in charge of picking up and dropping off the cars wouldn't allow its drivers out in a non-air conditioned vehicle over a certain temperature for health and safety reasons. Like, that's how bad it was. So I took it out one night at about 1 a.m, like deliberately stayed up late so I could go out at night when it was only about 85 degrees and stifling, and just take it for a more pleasant drive. And ended up just on this stretch not too far from my place, running into this guy in just a 5.7 liter Dodge Charger who rolled up next to me at a light, rolled his window down. He was like, "Hey, I love the Porsche." I was like, "Hey, I love the Charger, big Hemi fan." And of course, it was a stoplight, so we did what people do in such situations. But it was just like a good car guy moment, like it was two car people out doing car things when there was no one else around, kind of the way the most socially acceptable way to do socially unacceptable things, and just it was so perfectly coherent. It was like, okay, that was one of those moments where I knew I was doing the job that I want to be doing. And that car holds a special place in my heart for that reason. Every time I see a Cayman R pop up on Bring a Trailer or what have you, I always linger a little bit longer on that page than I might otherwise for another water-cooled Porsche.
That's a really good story. I think a lot of times you will get like a very high performance press car, and the time to drive it is really early or really late. I'm sort of a morning person because I just have to be, but driving early with coffee could be great. A little tougher in a Porsche because the cup holder situation isn't usually ideal. I think my best Cayman and Boxster story was I drove them both on the island of Mallorca in 2014. Oh, cool. It was the launch of that new version of both those cars, and we got some track time. I forget what the name of the track was. It was like a track where like the mystique of it, the history didn't quite match up to like factually some of the things I later found out. Like somebody had said it was like an F1 track or something. I don't know. That may or may not have been true, but it was more like a kind of a Moto GP or bike track by the time we were there. It was fun. It was fun to get the cars out on it. And it was fun to drive around just, that part of the world in those cars. It was really, really with the top down, the convertible, you really get that, like that Mediterranean feel. It's sublime. They handle so well. Just the manual transmission. It was so engaging. And I really think just for my money, I think they're the most perfectly tailored version of like a Porsche sports car. I think the 911, if that's what you want, there is no substitute. But when you start to look at the Cayman and the Boxster, just their size, their proportions, the layout of the engine, all the things that you want, to me, it's in some ways, I think a lot of people would agree with this, that this is the purest sports car, So, that was obviously anytime you're in the Mediterranean driving a Porsche, that's pretty memorable. But I drove a 718 last fall too, and that was actually pretty nice. I think it was a T, and that was right one of those times when the weather is kind of flipping from being still fairly warmish for Michigan, starting to get really cold, and you get all those great like the clouds, the sun, the sky, and then you're rolling around in this sports car that handles brilliantly and watching just the world around you in one of its most beautiful states. And, it's hard not to enjoy, a 718 in that sense. So, this is another segment where I think Porsche knows its customers well. I think they know themselves well. It's, I hope they don't change this too much, even as we look at electrification and all these other things that are going to happen. I think Porsche is a company that's going to try to sort of, take both paths, going forward.
Yeah, I agree. And honestly, looking at used cars for a while, as I was, like I mentioned, lingering on Bring a Trailer listings for a long time, I had convinced myself, this will give us a good segue into the next bit, that I was going to buy a Series 2 first generation, however you want to look at it, Dodge Viper. And at the same time, I was also looking a lot at like the refresh, like the 987 generation Caymans, when you could get the limited slip differential and all that. And they're just, it was so close to me thinking, well, between either one of those, I think I'd be very happy. Like a Porsche Cayman or Dodge Viper both make excellent little toys. And so they both kind of fell into the price range I was looking for. But, with everything going on with the pandemic and used prices being what they were, I got so frustrated with that market that when the black one came along, I just couldn't resist. But, I probably in a way I could say I came pretty close to buying a Cayman, just the same way I came pretty close to buying a Viper. So I think it's one of those cars that I'm going to revisit one day. I just haven't decided exactly how or when yet.
So you did a nice piece for us this week, Used Car Spotlight. We've done all sorts of different used car spotlights, but a Viper, that really, gets into its own sort of territory. I drove the last generation of Viper. I didn't drive the generation that you referenced here, the 92 to 02. And I think the most recent one was quite intense as it is. So I don't have a great frame of reference just how bonkers the older one was. But for me, it's a very visceral experience. Like, I love how Vipers look. It's interesting because it's such a raw car. You don't think of it as a thing of beauty. But it's for its time, and even now, I think it holds up extremely well. It's a very singular look, and I don't know, how's the market for used Vipers from 20 years ago?
It's crazy. The only ones that are truly cheap are going to be your like 92 to 95 RT10 topless roadsters, and I don't think people really appreciate just how topless those cars really were.
Yeah,
they really instead of having actual windows, the early ones had those little like drop-in inserts that were basically kind of like the half doors in a Jeep Wrangler. Yeah. And they're not civilized. And you look at a 400 horsepower sports car now and you think, oh, well, that's no big deal. Camaro and Mustang, you get more than 400 horsepower out of the V8 before you even start fiddling with like higher level trims or performance packages and stuff like that. You just, you get at least 450 horsepower just from a V8 these days. And so, a 400 horsepower V10 from 1994. How interesting can that car really be to drive by today's standards? But the problem is 400 horsepower was pushing the envelope back then. And that was only one of the envelopes it was pushing because that was a lot of power to put through the tire technology of the time. And you only had two wheels to use to do it. So people greatly underestimate just how imposing a Viper can be to drive. The early ones, if you drive them like a granny, they're actually very chill because they have so much torque. You basically just roll into gear. It doesn't take a whole lot of effort or thought to drive one slowly. But as soon as you decide you actually want to play around with that V10, the torque is so overwhelming that people get caught out before they even have a chance to get going fast. That's the problem. I would imagine this is pure speculation, but I would bet 90% of Viper accidents happen below 50 miles an hour because I'm just so confident that everybody who toasts one of those does so trying to do something as simple as like turning left out of a shopping center. It's the kind of thing where you're like, oh, I kind of need to punch it to make this gap in traffic. And then you just end up looping the thing, eating a curb and getting a $17,000 insurance bill because you damaged one of those nice pieces of fiberglass that they don't make anymore. And that's one of the things that kind of provides a barrier of entry to Viper ownership is that the cheap ones tend to not have extremely good body situations. Either the fiberglass has been damaged or the paint's been allowed to go to seed so badly that the body's been exposed and the fiberglass is just not in great shape. And those kinds of things are very expensive to fix on a Viper. The mechanical stuff, though, is pretty dead reliable. So it's hard to go wrong with these cars, but you just have to know that you're going to be spending a lot of money for something that you're probably going to have limited opportunity to enjoy, strictly because they're fair weather vehicles, and even under the best of circumstances, they're still really tricky to drive. You couldn't even get analog brakes in one until 2000, so it would have been effectively a 9-year-old car at that point. And even those, I remember in magazine testing back in the day, the analog brake system didn't actually improve stopping distances. And it shouldn't technically, because if you are threshold braking, if you are braking to the maximum capability of a non-ABS braking system, ABS won't make it do any better. It just lets you slam the pedal down and let the computer sort it out instead of having to actually modulate the pedal yourself. But it kind of points out that the Viper was already giving you everything it had. And for the time, that was it. So they had horrendous stopping distances because they were just big torque monsters designed to go. This car wasn't designed to slow down. And I mean, they won at Le Mans. It was a winning formula. It's not like, it was a one and done, or it was kind of a Bob Lutz marketing exercise or anything like that. It was the real deal. It was a highly competitive, exciting car that I think today might be not necessarily the most interesting sports car that was built in the 90s, but certainly one of them. And I would put it right next to like a 993. Like, if I could own either one of those forever, I'd be very happy to do so. They're so iconic. It's just really hard to go wrong.
It's interesting when you look back at the competitive set especially from the early 90s. You remember Ferrari and Lamborghini, their cars were basically junk at that point. People forget that after Enzo Ferrari died, there was a real sort of moment of crisis there. Luca de Montezemolo came in and basically saved that company, modernizing everything. The Corvette was nothing compared to this at that point. The Mustang and Camaro, they definitely went different routes. Like, the Viper really sort of stepped into that gap, and, it was a moment, for enthusiasts, for Chrysler, for Bob Lutz, they really just, it was almost insane that they did it. I think if you even went back and interviewed Bob Lutz, who's I think 90, his birthday was fairly recently, he would probably tell you he was a little surprised that they actually did it, especially when you look at that original Viper concept and then how close they ended up getting to production. It's such a singular experience. It really is. Like, even from my experience driving a newer one, if you will, the intimidation factor there was different, I almost say surprising than any other modern car I had driven at that point. Because a lot of times you'll get in something that's expensive or powerful, and you're like, okay, this isn't that bad. I've done this before. This is my job. I know what to do. I know if I have to limp it around at 45 miles an hour and on track just to get some impressions, I'll do it, because that's, you're a pro. You do it that way. The Viper is like all sorts of things coming at you. Like, it's hard to see out of. Like, the seating angle is hard. It's snarling at you. The shifts are tricky. There's just so much going on with it, and that's awesome. It's amazing. It's such a visceral, like, raw experience to drive a car like that, and it's so intense. I don't know if I'd ever want to own one, simply because, I would have to live out in the middle of nowhere and have just like literally the roads were my playground, so I could get comfortable, do whatever I wanted. And that would be it, but not too far out, because if I flipped the car, I would need them to be able to come and, get me, relatively quickly. So, there's always that. But I don't know. To me, the Viper has always been an object of fascination. There's just so much to it. And even the end of it, was really interesting. During Chrysler's bankruptcy, they almost sold it off. Not maybe quite as close as some people think, but also closer than some people might think. There were people who were interested in it. There were, I interviewed different investors, 10, 11 years ago who were like, yeah, I'm interested. I've talked to them. And then, different, I think, as they were being sold off to Fiat, I think it happened pretty quickly that Sergio Marchionne was like, yeah, wait a minute. You guys don't want to sell the Viper business. Hold on. We make Ferraris. You guys know that. Maybe don't sell that. That's pretty good. And I don't know. Did you ever get to the Viper factory, Conner Avenue in Detroit?
No, I didn't.
Super cool.
Yeah, that was far before my time here in Detroit, sadly. And yeah, to your point, like, one of the reasons why I ultimately ended up going for the Blackwing when it kind of fell into my lap was that, I told myself I could own a Viper and really just kind of appreciate looking at it and still be happy, even if I wasn't able to drive it very often, just because the first gen coupes, technically it's second gen. That's a whole other can of worms. But those, 96 to 02 coupes, just speak to me. Like that was like my childhood icon of a vehicle, you know, like that was the one I'm, point to the poster on the wall and say, that's the car I'm going to own one day. And I still feel that way. I just don't feel like I'm in the position to do it right now. As much as I did a year ago, I'm like, you know what? No, I love toys. I have a Miata for that, for toy things. And the Cadillac at least gives me a vehicle that's practical when when I need it to be practical, it can serve that purpose. A Viper is just never going to be practical for anything. So it was one of those kind of wake up moments for me where I said, okay, that's a car that, as much as I would enjoy to just have it in my driveway or in my garage, definitely garage around here, I'm not ready to do that right now. So, it's something I hope to revisit someday. And while I do love those early ones, I would kind of skip the middle generation ones, the third gen, the 2003 up to 08, I want to say it was, before they took the break. Those, even though you can get the ones with the crazy like high output engine and so just the design of them never really spoke to me. And then the Viper fans kind of derisively refer to them as the Camry generation cars because the designer who was in charge had, I think, contributed to the Toyota Camry, or it was actually his baby. I don't recall. This was before Ralph Gilles came in and, took design in a completely different and, in my opinion, much better direction. But, I look at the final years of it, the 14 through 17, and those to me are the true continuation of the first couple generations of the car. The shape was there, the kind of like, we're not going to screw around with like incremental power improvements. We're going for everything we can do right now. That's a Viper. And I feel like they really, as sad as it was to see it go, they ended it on the right note.
I think that speaks to, a couple things. One, just to how good of a caretaker and steward of Viper Ralph Gilles was in sort of its like final years, if you will. I think they could always bring it back, especially, as we start to rethink what, sports cars performance could be. My sense is it would be, if it ever did come back, it could be almost like a few years down the road, Stellantis decides they need an American sports car. We're going to make it electric or hybrid, but we're going to use the Viper name, and that's always a tricky proposition when you sort of bring back a name and put it on something rather than bringing back the thing. We've seen it in all different segments, but I'd be intrigued if they tried that maybe 5-10 years down the road. I think it's interesting too, because it was it's one of the cars that I think had like a very like natural death. It just, when it finally ended, everybody who had wanted one, I think, probably had a chance to get one. There's obviously the used car market, which is why we're talking about this. If you want to go get one, I think just safety, emissions. I think there were a variety of things that would have made it like untenable for, then FCA to continue building them. They even closed the factory, and now it's I believe it's the Chrysler Heritage Center. And they did a Christmas party there a few years ago, which was an amazing place to walk around, have a drink, and just look at all these iconic cars, from Fiats to Gremlins to Wagoneers to, yes, a few Vipers. So it's a pretty cool site. When it was a factory, I did a tour there back in, I'm dating myself here, 2008. It was, it was pretty old. It was like a very old factory that had not really been updated, and they were still making Vipers. They were like Viper sort of chassis and pieces and carcasses. Walking through the Viper like holding area was super cool. And honestly, that only made me more intrigued by Viper, just kind of visiting that, sort of ancestral home of it. So we'll see. That's the Viper. We're getting to the end of this podcast. I had a random thought that came into my head. Weather's getting kind of warm. I often like to think of like, what is the best beer? And by beer, I don't mean brand. I mean like spring beer, like that first beer you have on the patio when you can actually go outside and, okay, it's 50 degrees. I think I'll have a beer on my patio. Granted, I have beers on my patio throughout the winter because I like the snow, but spring beer would be an example. Another good one, golf beer. Your first tee and it's like, okay, we're going to crack open one, put it in the cooler, and another good scenario. So I don't know, I moved into my sunroom during this podcast. It's made me start to think, it's like right at the end of February, this is when you start to rethink your situations. You mentioned, there's nothing like reclining on the patio with a ghost parked in the driveway of your cottage and having a sixer. So what would be sort of your late February, early March best beer, if you know what I mean?
Man, that's a tough one. There, for the longest time, I was really heavy on summer and Christmas as like my 2 times of year for beer. I honestly like my go-to. This is my cop-out answer every time, but I just love a good amber pretty much any time of year. I mean, I know it's people really think of it more as like a fall to winter beer. I think, and like I get that, but it's one of those where like, you know, it kind of feels right all the time to me, except maybe when it's really, really hot outside and I want like a Bell's Oberon or something like that. But a Bell's Amber hits the spot for me pretty much all the time. I can't say no. And also the earliest brews of like a Sam Summer Ale, Sam Adams, like I can get into that. It's a little early yet. I mean, we're not even going to see them on shelves anytime soon. But like, you know, if I happen to have some hiding in a beer fridge in the cellar or something like that, like I could go for one of those. As soon as I get that hint that it's starting to turn warm, I'm ready for warm. Just like in like August when Oktoberfest beers first start hitting the shelves, I'm ready. Even if it's still 105 degrees outside, I'll go grab an Oktoberfest and enjoy it because it's just one of my favorites.
I'd agree with that. I think I may be a little too optimistic because it is still like February 24th. It's just like kind of a short month. It's actually like 26 degrees out. I think it's just sunny. So I'm kind of like looking ahead to things. I do like a good cold snap from Sam Adams in March.
Those are good.
That's a good one. It's a good one if you're, like I said, golf beer. It's March. You get a nice warm day. You can play. You don't care about getting your cleats all muddy. Have a cold snap. That's a good way to go. And I will say this, Bell's Amber is top 3 of my all-time favorite beers. Any circumstance, all year round, that's a good one too. So that's all the time we have on the Autoblog Podcast. Send us your questions. You spend my money. So it's podcast@autoblog.com. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a great rating, hopefully 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. Wherever you get your podcasts, be safe out there. We'll see you next week.